Tonight, we're descending into the mind of a killer who believes murder is mercy. A boy who looked at his own mother and saw something that needed to be destroyed. A teenager who spent years imprisoned in a government laboratory, his powers suppressed, his rage festering, waiting for the perfect moment to unleash hell. This is the story of Vecna, but that name came later, after the burning, after the transformation, after he became something that could barely be called human. Before the monster, there was Henry Creel. Before the interdimensional god of decay, there was a sensitive child who studied spiders with disturbing intensity and decided that humanity was a plague requiring extinction. We're descending into the rotting dimension that exists beneath reality itself, into the upside down, to understand the being who rules it. But to understand why Vecna wants to tear down everything we know, why he targets traumatized teenagers and traps them in their worst nightmares, why he believes the only honest response to human suffering is complete annihilation, we must go back. Back to 1959, back to a Victorian house in Hawkins, Indiana, where a family moved in with hope, and 4 days later, 3 of them were dead. Back to the moment when a boy with extraordinary gifts made a choice that would echo across decades and dimensions, a choice that would eventually threaten to consume our entire world. His story begins not in Hawkins, but in Rachel, Nevada, in the shadow of a military installation, where secrets bred like maggots in corpses. The year was 1959, though some accounts suggest Henry's troubles began even earlier. The Creel family seemed, from the outside, unremarkable. Victor Creel, the patriarch, was a war veteran who'd served his country with distinction. Virginia Creel, his wife, came from money, her great-uncle's recent death having left the family with enough wealth to pursue a fresh start. And their children, Alice and Henry, were bright, seemingly well-adjusted youngsters, ready to embrace whatever opportunities their new circumstances might provide. But something was wrong with Henry Creel. Profoundly, fundamentally wrong. The teachers noticed it first. His affect was flat, his social interactions strained and performative rather than genuine. He struggled to connect with other children, not from shyness or awkwardness, but from what seemed like a fundamental inability to understand why connection mattered. The doctors examined him, ran their tests, applied their diagnostic frameworks. They declared him broken, different, wrong in ways they couldn't quite articulate, but that nevertheless marked him as something apart from normal childhood development. Victor and Virginia hoped that leaving Rachel might cure what ailed their son. Hawkins, Indiana represented that fresh start, a small town far from the West, far from whatever darkness had settled over young Henry. They purchased a house on the outskirts of town, a sprawling Victorian structure that had stood empty for years. The locals whispered about it, but the Creels dismissed such superstitions. It was just a house, 4 walls, a roof, rooms enough for a family to spread out and begin again. They moved into the Creel house on March 10th, 1959. Within 4 days, 3 members of the family would be dead, and the sole survivor would spend the rest of his life in a psychiatric hospital, blamed for murders he didn't commit. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about what Henry Creel actually was, what made him different, what the doctors and teachers sensed but couldn't name. Henry possessed psychic abilities of extraordinary potency, telepathy that allowed him to peer into minds, to rifle through memories and secrets like pages in a book, telekinesis that gave him power over the physical world, the ability to move objects, to crush and break and destroy with merely a thought. These weren't abilities that developed gradually through puberty or emerged from experimental serums. They were intrinsic to who Henry was from his earliest years, perhaps even from birth. As a child, Henry found comfort in unlikely places. While other children played with toys or made friends, Henry studied spiders. Black widows in particular fascinated him. He would spend hours observing them, watching how they trapped prey in webs, how they approached their victims with patient inevitability, how they fed. He saw in spiders something pure, something honest. They were predators unbound by the false morality humans imposed on themselves. Most people fear spiders, he would later observe. They detest them. And yet I found them endlessly fascinating. More than that, I found great comfort in them, a kinship. This wasn't the casual interest of a child going through a phase. This was identification. Henry saw himself in those eight-legged hunters. He saw what he believed himself to be, what he believed he was meant to become. A predator, an apex organism, tasked with culling humanity's excess. The strange events began almost immediately after the Creels moved in. Victor would later describe them as demonic, the work of some malevolent entity that had claimed their home. Lights flickered without cause. Objects moved of their own accord. Dead animals began appearing around the property. Rats with broken necks. Birds twisted into impossible positions. A family cat crushed as if by an invisible hand. Virginia knew better. Virginia recognized that her son was the source of their torment. She saw the cold calculation in Henry's eyes when another dead animal appeared. She noticed his satisfaction, barely concealed, when the family gathered around some new, inexplicable horror. He wasn't being haunted, he was the haunting. She reached out to Dr. Martin Brenner. How she found him remains unclear. Perhaps she'd heard rumors of the work being done at Hawkins Laboratory. Whatever her reasoning, Virginia contacted Brenner, explained her concerns, and set in motion events that would eventually doom not just her family, but potentially the entire world. Brenner came to the Creel House, observed Henry, spoke with him, and recognized immediately what he was looking at. This wasn't mental illness or childhood behavioral problems. This was a genuine psychic phenomenon, a subject with abilities that exceeded anything Brenner had previously encountered. Henry Creel represented the key to unlocking human potential. Brenner wanted him, wanted to study him, to understand him, to replicate his abilities in other subjects. But Virginia didn't want her son taken away for study. She wanted him helped, perhaps even cured. When she realized Brenner's intentions, she made a different decision. She would have Henry institutionalized, placed somewhere he couldn't hurt anyone. She began making arrangements, contacting facilities, preparing to have her own son locked away. Henry, with his telepathic gifts, knew exactly what his mother planned. He could read her thoughts, feel her fear and determination, and he understood that she would succeed unless he acted first. On March 14th, 1959, just 4 days after the family had moved into the Creel House, Henry made his decision. If his mother wanted to imprison him, if his family couldn't accept what he was, then they didn't deserve to live. The assault was psychic and brutal. Henry reached into his mother's mind, showed her visions of her worst fears, then used his telekinesis to break her body. Bones snapped, limbs twisted into unnatural angles. Her eyes were torn from their sockets. Virginia Creel died in agony, her mind shattered before her body gave out. Alice, Henry's sister, suffered the same fate. Henry killed her with the same methodical brutality, crushed her like he'd crushed those animals. Victor, the war veteran who'd survived combat in the Pacific, was overwhelmed by what Henry did to his family. The visions Henry forced into Victor's mind broke something in the man's psyche. Victor survived, but only physically. Mentally, he was destroyed. The effort of killing his mother and sister proved too much, even for Henry's extraordinary abilities. He fell into a coma, collapsing amid the carnage he'd created. When authorities arrived, they found Victor Creel raving about demons and evil, his wife and daughter dead in ways that defied medical explanation, and his son unconscious but technically alive. Victor was arrested, tried, and convicted. He would remain in a psychiatric hospital for decades, endlessly insisting on his innocence. Henry, meanwhile, remained in his coma. That's when Dr. Brenner made his move. He used his government connections to claim custody of Henry Creel's comatose body. Henry would remain at Hawkins National Laboratory, would be studied, his abilities tested and measured. When Henry eventually woke, he found himself in a different kind of prison. Brenner explained the situation with clinical precision. Henry would remain here. He would be studied. In exchange, Brenner would keep Henry's secret, would protect him from prosecution. Brenner had a chip implanted in Henry's body, a device that inhibited his psychic abilities, made Henry controllable. And then Brenner designated him as Subject 1. Number 001. For years, Henry existed in this suppressed state. His powers muted, his potential caged. He served as an orderly within the laboratory. He watched as Brenner attempted to replicate his abilities in other subjects. Through MK-Ultra experiments, through breeding programs that targeted pregnant women, Brenner sought to create more psychics. Most failed to manifest significant abilities. But Brenner persisted. The other numbered children became Henry's charges. He was tasked with assisting in their training. It was cruel irony. Henry, whose abilities far exceeded any of theirs, was forced to nurture children who would never approach his potential. But Henry played his role. He observed, he learned. He waited for a test subject powerful enough to help him escape. That subject arrived on June 7, 1971. A newborn girl, taken from her mother within hours of birth. Terry Ives had been part of the MK-Ultra program while pregnant, and the drugs she'd been given had affected her developing child in unprecedented ways. This baby, designated Subject 11, showed immediate signs of psychokinetic ability. She was the most powerful psychic Brenner had encountered, aside from Henry himself. Henry watched 11 grow. He saw in her a kindred spirit, another person shaped and broken by Brenner's experimentation. But more than that, he saw an opportunity. If he could befriend 11, if he could gain her trust, he might be able to use her abilities to remove his suppressor chip. So Henry became the friendly orderly, gentle where others were harsh, encouraging where others were critical. He taught 11 things Brenner wouldn't, showed her kindness the doctor never provided. He created a bond, carefully and methodically. And 11, desperate for connection, responded exactly as Henry hoped. By 1979, 11 had developed her abilities to a remarkable degree. She was Brenner's success story. But she was also rebellious, questioning, beginning to resist the more brutal aspects of the testing regime. Henry saw his moment. He approached 11, told her that he understood her pain because he too had suffered under Brenner's control. He showed her his tattoo, the 001 marked on his wrist. He explained that he'd been the first. And then he told her about the chip, the suppressor that kept his powers locked away. If she could remove it, they could escape together. They could be free. 11 trusted him, used her powers to locate the chip within his body and tear it free. The moment his abilities returned, unshackled after years of suppression, Henry Creel felt whole for the first time in decades. His powers rushed back, stronger than they'd been even as a child. He was magnificent. He was unstoppable. And he had a facility full of people who deserved to die for what they'd done to him. September 8th, 1979. Henry told 11 to hide in a closet, to wait while he cleared a path for their escape. She did as instructed, trusting him completely. And then she heard the screams. Henry moved through Hawkins' laboratory like death itself. The guards who'd watched over him died first. He crushed them psychically, snapped their necks with a thought. The scientists who'd studied him followed. Henry took his time with some of them, made them experience terror before he killed them. And then, he turned his attention to the other children, 2 through 17, the numbered test subjects who'd lived alongside 11. They'd never done anything to Henry personally. Most were younger, some barely old enough to understand their circumstances. But Henry killed them anyway, not from rage or revenge, but from philosophy. These children were Brenner's attempts to create more weapons. Better that they die now, before they grew into extensions of Brenner's will. He killed them efficiently, 2, 3, 4, 5, falling one after another. Some tried to fight back, but they were children facing someone who'd had decades to refine his powers. 6, 7, 8. Henry moved methodically. 9, 10, 17. Each death was a statement. Brenner himself survived, having fled when the massacre began, but there was still one loose end. 11. The girl who'd freed him, but might also be able to stop him. He found her emerging from the closet. She stared at the carnage, at the blood and broken bodies of the only family she'd ever known. Henry stood at the center of it all, utterly calm. He explained his philosophy to her, told her about the spiders and predators, about how humanity was a plague that enforced unnatural structures. Wake, eat, work, sleep, reproduce, die. Everyone just waiting for it all to be over. He'd seen into enough minds to know that most people lived lives of quiet desperation. He wanted to free them through extinction, tear down all the structures and start fresh. And he invited 11 to join him, told her they were alike, both shaped by Brenner's experiments, both capable of extraordinary things. Together, they could remake the world. 11, staring at the corpses of her friends, said no. A simple refusal. No, I won't join you. I won't help you destroy everything. Henry attacked her. If she wouldn't help him, she was an obstacle to be eliminated. He used his powers to pin her against a wall, to begin crushing her. But 11 fought back. And in fighting for her life, she accessed levels of power she hadn't known she possessed. The battle was titanic. Henry was older, more experienced, but 11 had something he lacked. She had memory, she had love. She had that single moment when her Mother Terry had held her after birth, had whispered words of affection before Brenner stole her away. That memory became 11's anchor. She overpowered him, channeled everything she had into one devastating push. And she didn't just defeat Henry, she tore open a hole in reality itself, a gateway to another dimension. Henry, screaming, was flung through that impossible opening into a realm of darkness and decay. The portal sealed behind him, leaving no trace except 11's exhaustion and the bodies surrounding her. 11 collapsed. The trauma overwhelmed her. She repressed the memory, buried it so deep that she convinced herself she was the one who'd killed everyone. This false memory would haunt her for years. But we're not following 11's story tonight. We're following Henry's. And Henry's story was just beginning. The dimension 11 had banished him to was unlike anything Henry had experienced. As he fell through that impossible space, lightning arced across his body. Not normal electrical discharge, but dimensional energy that burned and scarred. His skin blistered, his clothes charred. The agony was absolute, and it lasted far longer than any human should have been able to endure. When Henry finally came to rest, he was fundamentally changed. Burns covered his flesh. His skin had taken on a greyish, corpse-like quality. His hair had been singed away. He was barely recognizable as human, but he was alive. He explored his new environment. This place was a wasteland. Desolate plains of dead earth. strange floating formations defying gravity, occasional creatures, predatory things that resembled animals from Earth but twisted, corrupted, and everywhere an oppressive sense of decay. At first, Henry believed 11 had killed him, that this was purgatory. But as he explored, as he discovered he could still use his powers, he began to understand. This wasn't an afterlife. This was another world, unspoiled by mankind, untouched by the structures he despised. It was perfect, a blank canvas. He became an explorer, mapped the strange geography, discovered those twisted creatures, demogorgons he would eventually learn to call them. They were predators, apex organisms. They reminded him of his spiders. And then Henry found something extraordinary, a storm of particles, a swirling, churning mass of what looked like living shadow. This entity responded to him, recognized him as something compatible. It was power on a scale he'd never imagined. But the entity was formless, chaotic. It had power but no direction, no will. Henry, remembering his childhood fascination with spiders, decided to give it shape. He used his powers to mold the particle storm, stretched it, shaped it, gave it structure that reflected his philosophy and obsessions. The result was magnificent, a massive spider-like being with a flame-shaped head. Henry had created the Mind Flayer, and in creating it, he transcended his human limitations. He was no longer Henry Creel. He was no longer one. He was something new. He was Vecna. The transformation wasn't instantaneous. Over months and years, Vecna's body continued changing. The burns gradually healed, but left him permanently disfigured. His pupils faded, becoming milky and pale. His nose dissolved entirely, leaving only a skeletal opening. Vines and tendrils of the dimension grew into his body, replacing damaged tissue, merging with his organs. His left hand elongated, fingers stretching into claws. And through the Mind Flayer, Vecna gained control of everything within the dimension. Every demogorgon, every vine, every spore. They all became extensions of his will. He was distributed across the entire realm. But the dimension he'd arrived in wasn't the Upside Down yet. It was Dimension X, a proto-realm that existed adjacent to normal reality. That transformation wouldn't occur until 1983, when 11 would accidentally create another gate. Vecna spent years in Dimension X, building his strength, refining his control. He had time, he had patience, and he had a plan. He would return to the world that had rejected him. He would tear down everything, remake reality in his image. But to do that, he needed a gate. That moment came on November 6th, 1983. 11, now 13, and still imprisoned at Hawkins Laboratory, was ordered by Brenner to make psychic contact with a creature his instruments had detected. A demogorgon. When 11's consciousness touched the creature, she inadvertently created exactly what Vecna had been waiting for. A gate. But more than that, the gate transformed the dimension. The moment the connection was established, Dimension X began mirroring Hawkins. Buildings appeared, twisted reflections of the town above. Streets formed in the decay. This was no longer Dimension X. This was the Upside Down, a mirror dimension that existed as both reflection and inversion of the world Vecna intended to conquer. The Demogorgon crossed through, entering Hawkins. It hunted. It killed. It took Will Byers, a 12-year-old boy who happened to be riding his bike near the laboratory. Will was pulled into the Upside Down, becoming the first human to experience Vecna's domain while still alive. And Vecna, monitoring everything through his hive mind connection, recognized his opportunity. He'd spent 4 years building his strength. Now he had access to the world above. In 1984, Vecna made his first direct move. Will Byers, rescued but forever changed, remained connected to the hive mind. Vecna possessed Will through the Mind Flayer, making the boy's body a spy. He also sent an army of adolescent demogorgons through tunnels that had grown beneath Hawkins. But 11 interfered. She closed the gate, severing the psychic link. The demodogs died, Will was freed, and Vecna was forced back. In 1985, when Soviet scientists beneath Starcourt Mall forced open a new gate, Vecna sensed another opportunity. A fragment of the Mind Flayer still existed in Hawkins. Vecna activated it, began possessing humans and rats. The Flayed. He had these possessed individuals collect chemicals that would allow him to create a proxy form, a body made from melted human biomass, shaped in the image of the Mind Flayer. This proxy form managed to wound 11, bit her leg, and infected her. But Joyce Byers and Jim Hopper closed the Soviet gate, severing Vecna's connection and rendering his proxy form inert. Again, he was forced back. Except this time, Vecna had learned something important. With enough concentration, he could form connections to humans across dimensional barriers. He didn't need a physical gate. He needed psychic bridges. He spent months building his strength, recovering from defeats, planning his next move, and developing a new ability. He learned to extend his telepathy across dimensions, to reach from the upside down into the minds of people in Hawkins, to form connections so intense they became physical links between worlds. In March of 1986, Vecna was ready. He needed test subjects, people whose minds he could invade, whose traumas he could exploit, whose deaths would create the gates he needed. So he began searching, scanning Hawkins, looking for the most vulnerable targets. He found them among the teenagers, young people carrying traumas they couldn't process, guilt they couldn't resolve, pain they couldn't escape. These damaged children were perfect. Their suffering made them easier to control, and their deaths would create gates strong enough to tear open permanent rifts. Vecna's method was refined. He would establish contact with a victim's mind, usually while they slept, or during moments of distress. Once the connection was formed, he would show them visions. Carefully curated nightmares drawn from their worst memories, deepest fears, most profound regrets. He would trap them in a mental landscape where escape seemed impossible. And while they were trapped, Vecna would manifest to them, not physically, but as a psychic projection. He would explain what he was doing, would watch as hope drained from their eyes. When the victim reached breaking point, Vecna would kill them. The method was always the same, an echo of how he'd murdered his mother and sister. He would break their limbs, snap bones with psychokinetic force. He would remove their eyes, tearing them from the sockets. And as they died, the intense psychic connection would tear open a physical gate. These weren't small gates. These were substantial rifts that would remain open, continue spreading corruption, and Vecna's plan required 4 of them. 4 deaths, 4 gates, arranged in a specific pattern. When the 4th gate opened, they would converge, creating one massive rift that would merge dimensions completely. His first victim was Chrissy Cunningham. On the surface, Chrissy seemed perfect. Head cheerleader, popular, dating the star, basketball player. But beneath that polished exterior, Chrissy was suffering. Her mother was emotionally abusive, constantly criticizing Chrissy's appearance, her weight. The pressure became unbearable. Chrissy developed an eating disorder that she hid from everyone. She began seeking help, started seeing the school counselor. But talking didn't make the problems go away. She needed something stronger. That's what led her to Eddie Munson, known drug dealer at Hawkins High. She wanted something that would knock her out completely. While Eddie was retrieving what she'd asked for, Vecna made contact. Chrissy froze, her consciousness trapped in the nightmare landscape Vecna constructed. She saw herself in her home, heard her mother's voice calling. The voice was wrong, distorted. Chrissy followed it through darkened hallways. She found her mother in a doorway, but it wasn't really her mother. The woman's face was twisted, decaying. And behind her, looming in darkness, was Vecna himself. He spoke to Chrissy about her pain, about how she'd tried to escape it, about how she'd always been doomed to this moment. Eddie returned to find Chrissy standing motionless, her eyes white and vacant. He tried to shake her awake, but she was beyond his reach, and Vecna delivered the killing blow. Chrissy's body rose into the air. Her limbs began to snap, her jaw dislocated, her eyes were torn away. Then her body dropped, dead before she hit the ground. Eddie screamed, ran. He was found at the scene, would become the primary suspect, but he wasn't the killer. He was just the first witness to Vecna's new method. The gate that opened at Chrissy's death was small but stable, permanent, a wound in reality. And Vecna felt it open. 1 down, 3 to go. His second victim was Fred Benson, a student journalist working alongside Nancy Wheeler. Fred seemed well-adjusted, focused on his work, but Fred carried a secret. A year earlier, he'd been in a car accident. He'd been driving, had hit and killed someone. The guilt consumed him. Fred started having visions, seeing the victim bloodied and accusing. He knew these were hallucinations, but they terrified him nonetheless. He started seeing Miss Kelly, trying to process what had happened, but talking didn't exercise his guilt. On March 22nd, Fred accompanied Nancy to investigate Chrissy's death. And then Fred saw his victim again, standing by the road, bloodied and broken. The figure began walking toward him. Fred tried to ignore it, but the vision persisted, and Fred, almost against his will, began walking toward it. Nancy noticed him leaving, but Fred was already too deep in Vecna's trap. He followed the vision into the woods, and then the landscape changed. Fred was back at the scene of his accident, reliving it, watching as the person he'd killed died again and again. Vecna appeared, emerging from shadows. He spoke to Fred about guilt, about stains that could never be washed away. Fred tried to bargain, to explain it had been an accident. But Vecna wasn't interested in absolution. Nancy heard Fred's screams, ran toward the sound, but by the time she arrived, Fred was already dead, eyes gone, limbs twisted. A second victim, a second gate. The town began to panic. 2 teenagers dead in less than 24 hours, both killed in inexplicable ways. The Hawkins police had no leads beyond Eddie Munson, who'd fled. Jason Carver, Chrissy's boyfriend, began organizing vigilantes, convinced that Eddie had killed her. But some people knew better. Nancy Wheeler, Steve Harrington, Robin Buckley, Dustin Henderson, and Max Mayfield recognized that something supernatural was happening. The method of death, the precision of injuries, the way both victims had entered trances, all suggested a new threat from the upside down. Vecna's third target was Patrick McKinney, one of Jason's basketball teammates. Patrick seemed confident, athletic, popular, but he was hiding trauma. His father was physically abusive, had been beating Patrick for years. Patrick lived in constant fear. Patrick had started seeing Miss Kelly, had tried to talk about his home situation without revealing the abuse. He was terrified that intervention would only make things worse. So, he suffered in silence. On March 23rd, Patrick joined Jason searching for Eddie at Lover's Lake. They took a boat onto the water, and that's when Vecna made contact. Patrick froze in the boat. Jason tried to wake him, but Patrick was already gone, trapped in Vecna's nightmare, reliving his worst beatings, hearing his father's voice screaming. Vecna manifested, explaining that all the pain Patrick had endured had led to this moment, that there was no escape. Patrick's body rose from the boat, levitated over the water. His limbs snapped. His eyes were torn away. Then he dropped into the lake. 3 down, 1 to go, and Vecna had already selected his final victim. Max Mayfield had survived an abusive childhood with her stepfather Neil Hargrove and his son Billy. Neil's emotional and physical abuse had left scars, and then Billy had died at Starcourt Mall the previous summer. He'd been possessed by the Mind Flayer but had broken free long enough to sacrifice himself, protecting Eleven and Max. Max blamed herself. Convinced herself that if she'd been a better sister, Billy might have survived. The guilt consumed her, coupled with grief over losing the only person who'd understood what their family life had been like. She withdrew from her friends, isolated herself, stopped participating in activities. She was depressed, suicidal in ways she barely acknowledged, and she'd been seeing Miss Kelly, trying to process her feelings. But talking didn't help. Nothing helped. Vecna had been watching Max for weeks, recognizing her as the perfect final victim. Her trauma was profound, her isolation nearly complete, and there was poetry to using her. Billy had been one of the flayed. Now his sister would die serving Vecna's purposes. Max started experiencing visions, seeing Billy's corpse, bloodied and accusing. She heard clocks chiming when no clocks were present, saw the grandfather clock from the Creel House manifesting in walls and doorways. Her friends noticed her distress. They researched Victor Creel, discovered the connection between the 1959 murders and the current killings. Nancy and Robin visited Victor, learned about the demon he believed had killed his family, and slowly they pieced together the truth. The killer wasn't a demon, it was Henry Creel, Victor's son who'd survived, who'd become one at Hawkins Laboratory, who'd been banished by 11 to the Upside Down. Vecna. The name came from Dustin, recognizing similarities to a villain from Dungeons and Dragons, but understanding who Vecna was didn't provide a way to stop him. Max was already marked, and on March 24th, Vecna made his move. Max was at the cemetery visiting Billy's grave when she entered a trance. She found herself back at Billy's grave, but the cemetery was wrong, dark and twisted. Billy's corpse emerged from the grave, rotted and accusatory. He told Max it was her fault he'd died. Then Vecna appeared, not as an apparition, but as a massive presence that towered over the cemetery. He spoke to Max about her guilt, about her desire to die, about how her death would make all of this possible. She would be his final victim, his masterpiece. But Max's friends had discovered something crucial. Music could break Vecna's connection. If they could play Max's favorite song, something deeply meaningful, it might give her strength to break free. Lucas discovered Max's favorite song was Running Up That Hill by Kate Bush. They found a cassette, rushed to the cemetery, and played it through her headphones. The music reached Max even in Vecna's mental prison. It became an anchor, a thread leading back to reality. Max began running, fleeing from Vecna through the nightmare landscape. Vecna pursued her, his massive form crashing through the mental architecture. He told her she couldn't escape, but Max kept running, ran toward a glowing red door that had appeared, a manifestation of her connection to reality. She burst through just as Vecna's hand reached for her. She woke in the cemetery, gasping and crying, her friends surrounding her. She'd escaped, become the first person to survive Vecna's attack. And without the fourth death, Vecna's plan was stalled. The group realized they needed to go on the offensive. If they waited for Vecna to attack Max again, she might not escape a second time. They needed to find Vecna's physical location in the Upside Down and kill him while he was vulnerable. Through Nancy's work, they discovered his location, the Creel House. Of course it was the Creel House. that Victorian structure where Henry had killed his family, where he'd first demonstrated his full powers. Vecna had claimed it as his lair. The assault. Team entered the Upside Down through a gate at Lover's Lake. Steve dove in to investigate and got pulled through by Vecna's vines. He found himself in the Upside Down version of Hawkins, being attacked by Demobats. Nancy, Robin, and Eddie dove in after him. They fought off the Demobats, with Steve taking serious injuries. As they traveled to the Creel House, Steve had a conversation with Nancy that revealed his deepest desires. He told her about a dream he'd had. In it, he and Nancy were together, married, traveling in an RV with their 6 kids. It was vulnerable and honest. The group reached the Creel House, prepared to attack Vecna while he was distracted. Back in Hawkins, Max had volunteered as bait. She allowed herself to enter the trance, let Vecna pull her into his mental prison. Because as long as he was focused on killing her, he couldn't defend his physical body. Steve, Nancy, and Robin attacked with Molotov cocktails and a shotgun. They set Vecna's body on fire, shot him repeatedly. But killing Vecna proved harder than anticipated. Even as his body burned, he remained alive, remained conscious enough to continue his assault on Max. In the mental landscape, Max was fighting for her life. Vecna had her trapped, was slowly breaking her bones, destroying her body while keeping her conscious. She screamed for Lucas, for anyone to help. Then 11 arrived. Not physically, but psychically. She'd been in Nevada, in a pizza parlor, where she'd created a makeshift sensory deprivation tank. She projected her consciousness across the country, entered the Upside Down psychically, and confronted Vecna. The battle between 11 and Vecna was titanic. Vecna told 11 that she'd made him, that by banishing him, she'd created the monster he'd become. He told her she belonged with him, that they were alike, and 11 refused. Told him she wasn't like him, would never be like him. But Vecna was stronger than he'd been in 1979. Years in the Upside Down, his connection to the Mind Flayer, his integration with the dimension, all had amplified his powers. He overpowered 11, threw her consciousness across the mental landscape. In the Upside Down, Vecna's burning body fell from the Creel House window. Steve approached cautiously, but when he reached the spot, the body was gone. Vecna had escaped, wounded but alive, and in Hawkins, Vecna completed his work on Max. Her limbs snapped, her eyes were torn away, her heart stopped. She died, becoming Vecna's 4th victim. 4 gates tore open across Hawkins, massive rifts that began at the sites where Chrissy, Fred, Patrick, and Max had died. The gates spread, carving through the town, converging toward a central point. The Upside Down began bleeding through. Spores filled the air. Vines and decay spread across familiar streets. Hawkins was being transformed, becoming a hybrid realm where normal reality and the corrupted dimension overlapped. But 11 refused to let Max die. Even as Max's heart stopped, 11 reached into her chest psychically and restarted her heart through sheer will. She pulled Max back from death through powers that exceeded anything she'd previously demonstrated. Max's body lived, her heart beat. But when 11 tried to find Max's consciousness in the void, she found nothing. Max's mind was gone, taken by Vecna when she died, leaving only an empty shell. Vecna had achieved his goal: 4 deaths, 4 gates. Hawkins was breached, invaded, transformed. The Upside Down had claimed significant territory, and the gates continued spreading slowly, consuming more of Hawkins with each passing day. He'd failed to kill 11, failed to claim Max's mind and body completely, but he'd succeeded in opening his invasion route. From his lair in the Upside Down, wounded but recovering, Vecna observed what he'd accomplished: the gates spreading through Hawkins, the dimension bleeding into reality, the panic and chaos consuming the town as residents fled. It was beautiful, the beginning of the end for humanity's artificial structures, the first step toward remaking the world according to his vision. He thought about his journey, from Henry Creel, the sensitive boy who'd killed his family, to Subject 1, the imprisoned weapon in Brenner's laboratory, to Vecna, the god of the Upside Down. Every step had brought him closer to this moment. 11 had banished him, but that banishment had given him access to powers beyond anything he'd possessed as merely human. Hawkins had rejected him, but now Hawkins would be consumed by the dimension he controlled. The Mind Flayer, that cosmic entity Henry had shaped and controlled, spread its influence through the gates. It could now directly touch the world above, could begin corrupting and claiming territory in ways that had been impossible when the dimensions were fully separated. Demogorgons and other creatures could cross through freely, establishing hunting territories in Hawkins. Vecna's philosophy, his belief that humanity needed to be culled or eliminated entirely, was finally being put into practice on a meaningful scale. The residents of Hawkins were fleeing or dying. The town's infrastructure was collapsing. The military would eventually respond, would try to contain the dimensional breach, but Vecna believed they would fail. How do you fight an enemy who controls an entire dimension? He reflected on his relationship with the Mind Flayer and the question of who truly controlled whom. Vecna insisted that he'd shaped the entity, that he'd given it purpose and direction, that he was the spider and the Mind Flayer was merely his web. But was that true? Or had the cosmic entity been manipulating him all along, using his trauma and philosophy to gain access to Earth? The answer might not matter. Whether Vecna controlled the Mind Flayer or served it, the result was the same. A malevolent intelligence with nearly unlimited power was invading Earth through the gates Vecna had opened. The distinction between Vecna's will and the Mind Flayer's desires had become academic. Vecna's victims haunted him in ways he didn't fully acknowledge. Chrissy, Fred, Patrick, Max, their faces, their traumas, their final moments. He told himself he felt no remorse, that their deaths were necessary, that they'd been casualties in a war against humanity itself. But he remembered each of them individually, remembered how they'd begged, how they'd tried to bargain, how hope had died in their eyes. Did that make him evil? He didn't think so. Evil was a construct, a label applied by societies to behaviors that threatened their stability. He was beyond such judgments. He was a predator, and predators weren't evil for hunting. They were simply fulfilling their nature. His mother Virginia had tried to imprison him. Brenner had succeeded for years, but 11 had inadvertently freed him by banishing him to a dimension where no one could contain him, where he could grow and evolve and become what he'd always been meant to be. He owed 11 for that, in a perverse way. She'd tried to destroy him and had instead elevated him to godhood. And now he would repay her by destroying everything she loved, by proving that her philosophy of connection and love was naive, childish, doomed to fail. When Hawkins fell completely, when the Upside Down consumed the town and everyone in it, 11 would understand that his way was the only truth that mattered. The wounds Vecna had sustained from the assault on his physical body were healing, but slowly. The Molotov cocktails had burned away significant portions of his flesh. The shotgun blasts had done internal damage. He would survive, would recover, but he needed time. Time to heal, time to rebuild his strength, time to plan his next move, and he had time. The gates were open. Hawkins was falling. His enemies were scattered, traumatized, unsure how to proceed. 11 had exhausted herself pulling Max back from death. No one would be able to mount an immediate counterattack. Vecna could afford to be patient, to recover fully before pressing his advantage. He thought about what would come next. The complete consumption of Hawkins was inevitable now. The military would establish a perimeter. would try to contain the dimensional breach, but they couldn't stop the gates from spreading. Eventually, the Upside Down would extend beyond Hawkins, would claim surrounding towns and cities. And everywhere it spread, Vecna's influence would follow. The endgame, the complete merger of dimensions that would transform Earth into an extension of the Upside Down, was now plausible. Difficult, certainly. It would require vast amounts of psychic energy, but it was possible. And once accomplished, there would be no reversal. Earth would become the Upside Down. Humanity would become subject to Vecna's will. What would that world look like? Vecna had vague ideas, but no concrete plans. Perhaps simple destruction was sufficient. Tear down all structures, eliminate all systems, return everything to a more primal state where only the strong survived. A world of predators and prey, honest in its brutality. Or perhaps he would establish himself as an actual god, with worshippers and temples. Rule openly rather than from shadows. The humans who survived could serve him, could dedicate their existence to furthering his will. He could select the best of them, the strongest and most adaptable, and allow them to live in exchange for total obedience. But these were thoughts for later. For now, Vecna focused on recovery, on healing his wounds and rebuilding his strength, on maintaining the gates he'd opened and ensuring they continued spreading, on preparing for the inevitable counterattack that Eleven and her allies would eventually mount, because they would try to stop him, would try to close the gates, to sever his connection to Hawkins, to find some way to reverse what he'd accomplished, and he would be ready for them, would crush them when they came, would show Eleven that she'd had her chance to join him, to embrace his philosophy and remake the world together, and she'd refused. That refusal would be the last meaningful choice she ever made. After that, she would exist only to suffer, to watch everything she'd fought for crumble, to understand that her way had failed and his way had won. Vecna's connection to the Creel House remained profound. Even decades after the murders, even transformed into the monster he'd become, he felt drawn to those rooms. The house in the Upside Down was a perfect reflection of how it had been in 1959. The furniture placed exactly as his mother had arranged it. The grandfather clock still ticking in its hallway alcove. His old bedroom remained untouched. He sometimes wondered if he could have turned out differently, if his mother hadn't tried to institutionalize him, if Brenner hadn't claimed him, if Eleven hadn't banished him, would he have found another path? Could he have integrated into human society, hidden his abilities, lived a relatively normal life? The answer, he suspected, was no. He'd always been what he was. The circumstances had shaped how he expressed his nature, but they hadn't created that nature. He'd been a predator from the beginning. The spiders he'd loved as a child had recognized it. The teachers and doctors who'd examined him had sensed it. His mother had seen it clearly enough to try to lock him away. They'd all been right to fear him. He was dangerous, always had been, always would be. The difference now was that he'd stopped pretending otherwise, stopped trying to fit himself into frameworks that didn't accommodate what he was. He'd embraced his nature fully, had become the ultimate expression of everything humanity feared. The psychological profile of Vecna reveals layers of complexity beyond simple villainy. He genuinely believes his philosophy is correct, that humanity's structures are prisons, that he's liberating people through destruction. This isn't rationalization. It's sincere conviction shaped by a lifetime of being told he was wrong, broken, dangerous. Society rejected Henry Creel, so Henry Creel rejected society. And in that rejection, he found purpose. His relationship with suffering is particularly revealing. Vecna doesn't torture his victims purely for sadistic pleasure. He tortures them because he believes suffering reveals truth. When he traps someone in their worst memories, forces them to relive their traumas. He's showing them what he sees as reality, stripped of comforting illusions. But there's cruelty in his methods that suggests something beyond philosophical conviction. The way he speaks to his victims, the taunting tone, the pleasure he takes in explaining their helplessness, all of it reveals someone who enjoys having power over others. Someone who was powerless for so long that exercising absolute dominance has become intoxicating. Vecna tells himself he's a force of nature, but his behavior suggests something more personal. This is revenge. Not against specific individuals necessarily, but against the concept of a world that rejected him. The choice to target teenagers rather than adults is interesting. On a practical level, teenagers carrying unresolved trauma are psychically vulnerable. But there's also symbolic weight. These are people at the threshold of adulthood, about to become the next generation perpetuating the systems Vecna hates. Does Vecna understand this? Does he recognize that he's targeting the vulnerable, the damaged, the people who've already suffered? Or does he genuinely believe he's doing them a favor? The show suggests both are true. He's aware of the cruelty, aware that he's choosing victims who can't easily defend themselves. But he's also convinced himself that their deaths serve a higher purpose. The aesthetic of Vecna is worth examining. His physical form, burned and twisted, integrated with vines and decay, is deliberately grotesque. But beneath the monster makeup is still recognizably human anatomy. He has a face, however damaged. He has hands, however clawed. He speaks with a human voice, however distorted. He's not a cosmic horror beyond human comprehension. He's a human who's become monstrous, which is somehow more disturbing. The scars from his burning, the missing nose, the pale eyes, all mark him as damaged. They're evidence of what 11 did to him, permanent reminders that he's been hurt and has survived. And they make him sympathetic in complicated ways. This isn't a pristine villain operating from untouchable power. This is someone who's been through hell and carries the marks. But that external corruption reflects internal reality. Vecna's body represents his psyche made visible. The decay that's consumed him mirrors the psychological rot that turned a sensitive child into a genocidal monster. The vines growing through him represent his integration with the upside down. The missing eyes in his victims echo his own damaged eyes. The grandfather clock that appears to Vecna's victims deserves special attention. This isn't random symbolism. The clock from the Creel House was significant to Henry during his childhood. By making it appear to his victims, by using its chiming as a death knell, Vecna is weaponizing his own trauma. The clock represents time, inevitability, the ticking countdown toward death that everyone lives under. Vecna makes his victims hyper-aware of that countdown, and there's poetry in using a Victorian timepiece. Those grandfather clocks were heirlooms, meant to mark family time across generations. They represented continuity, tradition, structures connecting past to future. By corrupting this symbol, Vecna is expressing his philosophy. He's taking mechanisms of human meaning-making and perverting them. The mental landscapes Vecna constructs for his victims reveal his understanding of psychology and memory. These aren't random nightmares, but carefully crafted scenarios designed to maximize psychological damage. He pulls from their specific memories, their particular traumas, creates customized hells. This takes time and effort. He has to study each victim, understand their psychology, identify their vulnerabilities. This precision raises questions about Vecna's activities during the years between his banishment and his emergence as a killer. What was he doing all that time? The show suggests he was consolidating power, recovering from injuries, shaping the Mind Flayer. But was he also studying? Observing humanity from his dimensional prison, learning about psychology and trauma? His attacks in Season 4 demonstrate sophisticated understanding of psychiatric concepts, of how guilt and depression and PTSD manifest and can be exploited. That knowledge had to come from somewhere. Perhaps he was watching through the gates, observing the therapists who tried to help people, learning their methods so he could pervert them. Or perhaps his telepathy gave him access to that knowledge directly. The relationship between Vecna and Dr. Brenner deserves deeper examination. Brenner created the circumstances that allowed Henry to become Vecna. By implanting the suppressor chip, by keeping Henry imprisoned for years, Brenner ensured that Henry's resentment would fester. A wiser approach might have been to help Henry integrate his abilities. But Brenner was a scientist first, and yet Vecna never targets Brenner directly. When he escapes in 1979, Brenner flees to safety. When Vecna begins his assault in 1986, he doesn't seek out Brenner. This could be practical consideration, but it might also suggest that Vecna's feelings toward his captor are more complex than simple hatred. Brenner was awful, but he also kept Henry alive, gave him purpose, even if it was a purpose Henry resented. In a twisted way, Brenner was the closest thing to a father figure Henry had after Victor was institutionalized. Or perhaps Vecna simply doesn't care about Brenner anymore. Revenge against one man seems petty compared to destroying the entire world. The question of whether Vecna can be redeemed is central to understanding his character. Is there still enough of Henry Creel inside the monster for him to potentially change? The show seems to suggest no. Vecna has gone too far, has committed too many atrocities, has become too integrated with his philosophy and his monstrous form. But that doesn't mean he's without humanity entirely. His speeches reveal someone who's still engaged in meaning-making, still trying to justify his actions. A truly alien intelligence wouldn't bother, but Vecna does. He wants his victims to understand. This need for validation suggests someone who's still fundamentally human, despite his monstrous transformation. There's loneliness in Vecna that he probably doesn't fully acknowledge. He's alone in the Upside Down, the only human consciousness in a dimension of monsters. He has the Mind Flayer, has his hive mind connection. But those aren't genuine relationships. There's no one to talk to, no one who can understand his perspective. That's why his offer to 11 was sincere. When he invited her to join him, he was offering more than partnership. He was offering companionship, someone who might understand him, who might share his exile and his power. 11 rejected that offer absolutely, but the fact that he made it reveals something important. He doesn't want to be alone. He just can't accept connection on any terms except his own. This inability to compromise defines Vecna's tragic flaw. He's brilliant, powerful, philosophically sophisticated, but he's also rigid, absolutist, incapable of genuine self-reflection. He's built a worldview that justifies his worst impulses and refuses to examine whether that worldview might be flawed. 11 represents everything Vecna could have been if he'd made different choices. She endured similar trauma, similar exploitation by Brenner, similar isolation and abuse, but she chose connection over destruction. And that choice, repeatedly reinforced through her relationships, has made her stronger than Vecna in ways that pure power can't measure. The final confrontation between Vecna and the forces arrayed against him remains inevitable. He's opened the gates, has begun merging dimensions, but he hasn't won. Hawkins is wounded, but not dead. 11 is exhausted, but not defeated. There's still time to stop him, still possibility of closing the gates and severing his connection to the world he's trying to destroy. And Vecna knows this, knows that his victory isn't guaranteed. He's been stopped before, defeated before, driven back before. 11 has thwarted him twice now. Both times, Vecna was certain of victory, and both times 11 found a way to resist him. Will there be a third confrontation? Almost certainly. What form that strike will take remains unknown. He could attempt to kill Max again. He could target 11 directly. He could simply continue expanding the gates. Or he could attempt something more ambitious, some working that would merge the dimensions entirely in a single catastrophic event. Whatever he chooses, it will be calculated. Vecna doesn't act impulsively. Every move serves a purpose, advances his goals. He's had decades to refine his philosophy and methods. He's been patient when patience was required, aggressive when aggression was appropriate. But for all his planning and power, Vecna is still Henry Creel. Still the boy who killed his family, who was rejected by his mother, who spent years imprisoned. Those experiences shaped him, created the monster he became, and they remain his vulnerabilities. The same trauma that gave him purpose also limited his understanding. He sees humanity through the lens of his own suffering, interprets all social structures as prisons because the structures he experienced were genuinely oppressive. But he's wrong. Not everyone experiences life as he did. His philosophy is based on overgeneralization. And this blindness makes him vulnerable to tactics he can't anticipate. 11 has friends, has family, has people who love her and whom she loves in return. These relationships give her strength that Vecna can't comprehend because he's never experienced genuine connection. He thinks he understands love and friendship, but understanding intellectually isn't the same as feeling emotionally. And when the final battle comes, that difference will matter. Vecna will fight with power and philosophy, with certainty in his righteousness. But 11 will fight with love, with the connections she's built, with the people she's protecting. And love, messy and imperfect as it is, might prove stronger than all of Vecna's accumulated power. Or it might not. That's the terrifying possibility. Vecna might win. The gates might spread beyond control. The upside down might consume everything. The monster who was once a sensitive boy might achieve everything he's dreamed of. The story of Vecna is ultimately the story of what happens when trauma metastasizes into philosophy, when pain becomes worldview, when suffering is transformed into crusade. Henry Creel experienced genuine injustice and cruelty. He was failed by every system that should have helped him. But instead of seeking healing, he decided that the problem wasn't with specific people or particular systems, but with humanity itself. And in doing so, he became exactly what his mother feared. Not because he was born evil, but because he made choices at every turning point that led him deeper into darkness. He chose violence over vulnerability, chose destruction over creation, chose isolation over connection, and each choice made the next one easier until there was no path back toward humanity remaining. Could he have been saved? The question is unanswerable, but important. It suggests that monsters aren't born, but created through accumulated failures of care. That Henry's transformation represents a systemic failure as much as an individual choice. But that doesn't absolve him. Understanding how someone developed a genocidal philosophy doesn't make that philosophy acceptable. The balance between understanding Vecna's origins and condemning his actions is delicate but essential. We can understand how Henry Creel became Vecna while still recognizing that Vecna needs to be stopped, that his plan would result in atrocities dwarfing any injustice he experienced. This nuanced approach to villainy elevates Stranger Things storytelling. Vecna is more frightening because he believes he's right, because he can articulate his philosophy in ways that sound almost reasonable before the full implications become clear. He's not crazy or irrational. He's wrong, profoundly and dangerously wrong, but wrong in ways that emerge from internally consistent logic. Fighting someone like that requires more than power. It requires being able to articulate why their premises are flawed. It requires engaging with the ideas rather than just the threat, proving through argument and example that connection has value, that suffering can be endured without being weaponized. 11 does this not through speeches, but through her life and choices. She's experienced trauma equal to what Henry experienced, and she chose differently at every turning point. Her existence disproves Vecna's philosophy more effectively than any argument could. She's living evidence that his path wasn't inevitable. The ultimate question Stranger Things poses through Vecna is whether humanity deserves to survive. He's looked into countless minds, has seen the cruelty and suffering that defines so much of human experience, and he's concluded that the answer is no. But the show argues through its cast that humanity does deserve survival. Not because humans are inherently good, but because within all the pain are also moments of genuine beauty, connection, love. The friendships between characters, the sacrifices they make for each other, all demonstrate that human existence has value beyond what can be measured in suffering. Vecna can't see this because he's spent too long isolated, too long viewing humanity from outside rather than participating in it. He knows humans intellectually, but doesn't understand them emotionally, doesn't grasp that the messiness of human relationships creates something valuable even when it's not optimal. That's what he'll lose to in the end. Not superior power, though 11 may match his abilities, but to the power of connection, of community, of people fighting together because they care about each other. It's not a philosophical argument that will defeat him. It's the living proof that his philosophy is incomplete. And when Vecna falls, when his body is finally destroyed, when his gates close and the Upside Down retreats, the victory won't be purely triumphant. Because the tragedy of what he could have been will remain. Henry Creel could have been a hero, could have used his abilities to help people. Instead, he became the thing he claimed to oppose. That tragedy is part of what makes Vecna such an effective villain. He's not just a threat to be eliminated. He's a cautionary tale about what happens when trauma metastasizes, when suffering curdles into hatred, when isolation becomes chosen rather than imposed. He's a warning about paths that look like liberation, but lead to destruction. His story matters because it's almost recognizable. Most people will experience trauma and face the choice of how to respond to it. Will face the temptation to universalize their pain, to decide that because they've suffered, everyone should suffer. Will face the seductive simplicity of tearing down rather than building up. And in those moments, Vecna serves as both warning and challenge. Warning of where that path leads. Challenge to choose differently, to engage with the difficult work of processing trauma and building connections despite the risk. Challenge to believe that vulnerability and care have value even when they're painful. That's the true horror of Vecna, not his powers or his murders, but his representation of a choice anyone might make in their darkest moments. The choice to decide that nothing matters, that everyone should suffer as you've suffered, that the only honest response is to burn it all down. He's the path not taken, the future avoided, the person you don't want to become. And defeating him means more than closing gates. It means rejecting his philosophy, means choosing connection over isolation, hope over despair, building over destroying. Means believing that despite all evidence to the contrary, there are things worth fighting for, worth living for, worth becoming vulnerable for. That's what 11 knows, and what Vecna can never understand. That the connections we form, imperfect and painful as they sometimes are, give life meaning that survival alone could never provide. When she faces him in the final battle, these will be the weapons that matter. Because in the end, Vecna is already defeated in the way that matters most. He's alone, He has power but no purpose beyond destruction. He has certainty but no joy. He has cosmic knowledge but no wisdom. He's achieved everything his philosophy promised and discovered it was empty. Perhaps in that final moment before 11 ends him, he'll understand what he could have been, what he chose to destroy in others because he couldn't find it in himself. Or perhaps not. Perhaps he'll die certain of his righteousness. Either way, his story serves as counterpoint to every hero's journey in Stranger Things. He's what happens when extraordinary ability meets trauma without support. When pain becomes philosophy. When isolation becomes identity. He's the cautionary tale that makes every choice toward connection meaningful. He's the darkness that gives light its value. The despair that makes choosing to care an act of courage. If you made it this far, thank you for taking this journey with me through Vecna's dark history. If you enjoyed this exploration of one of Stranger Things' most complex and terrifying villains, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the characters and lore that make our favorite sci-fi and fantasy universes so compelling. Drop a comment below and let me know what aspect of Vecna's character disturbs you most, or what other Stranger Things lore you'd like us to explore next. And if you really want to support the channel, share this video with someone who loves Stranger Things as much as we do. The algorithm loves it when you do that, and it helps us keep bringing you these comprehensive breakdowns of the stories and characters that haunt our imaginations. Until next time, stay curious. Thanks for watching.